My name is John Norman, and I'm a 55 or more year resident of the state of Alaska. I went to the University of Missouri. My educational background is in geology and in law. And after service in the Army, I came and took a job with Skelly Oil Company in Midland, Texas. And following my time there in Midland, an opportunity opened up in Skelly's office here in Anchorage, Alaska, and I jumped at the chance to take it, and that's what led me to come to Alaska. Well, going back to Midland first, Midland was an excellent place to learn the oil business. I was pretty green when I first went out there. I knew I wanted to get in the oil business, but I really didn't know much about it other than the basics, the geology of it, and I knew I wanted to get into exploration. So I took every opportunity that I could get on weekends to go out and sit wells with the geologists, things like that. Other than that, I was working on unit agreements and operating agreements, leases, that type of arrangements, title issues. And I remember the first time that I went out with a geologist, he looked far off in the distance at a rig out in West Texas, and he said, "Oh, it looks to me like they're on a trip." And I tried to compute that, and I thought, oh, gee, I guess we won't get to see them. They went into town for supplies. So then that was one way I learned what being on a trip meant. But in Midland, in that way, I gradually absorbed the terminology of the oil industry. I learned what a Kelly was and a whipstock, and all these terms. And on the streets of Midland, Texas, why every cab driver had a map and a deal, and you just couldn't get away from it. And so I would say in Midland, Texas, I got about 10 years experience that I didn't realize I was getting. I also got experience in the public land system across the border in Mexico, experience with federal filings and participation in federal sales, and also over-the-counter filings, and then with public land in the state of Texas. So I had a lot of experience working with both public land systems, land acquisition, acquiring land rights under public system as well as private system. Now coming forward, when I came to Anchorage, my task here was to be the exploration representative. That was my title, and it was a single office, and I was in office on the 5th floor of the First National Bank building. And Skelly had a position of 25% of production in Cook Inlet. And I replaced Don Bruce, who was originally the state geologist. I believe he was the first state geologist of Alaska and came to work for Skelly. And so I took his place when he left Skelly. And my job here was to do whatever needed to be done. I received all of the reports that you got as a non-working partner, all of the logs and everything else, that information. Most of it I would simply forward on, but a lot of it I would look, and then I could confer locally if I needed to. Then I had several projects, and I think those might be of interest right now as we look back. Our interest in those days, we vaguely knew about Prudhoe Bay. We'd heard about it, but even in the industry, it wasn't widely known, the size of that discovery at that time. It was still held pretty tight. And so my interest at that time in exploration, we were focused out in Bristol Bay. There was a proposed state offering out there on state offshore lands. And one project I had to look at was if we acquired leases, how would we then cross the peninsula? How would we acquire rights of way? Pipe for a pipeline? How would we get product across? And how would we find a deep water port that we could then transport out of and move that oil to market? So I had to go work on that and write a report on that. Another area we looked at was the Gulf of Alaska. There were a lot of wells looked at in the Gulf of Alaska. And what I'm trying to do here is convey a picture of what the average person in 1968, now this is 1968, we knew that something was going on the North Slope. We certainly knew that, but we didn't know the size of it. And we couldn't foresee fully what we know today. So at that time, we were still looking at places like the Gulf of Alaska. Wells were being drilled out there. We were interested in an area called the Robinson Mountains there. And then there was an area up in the interior, the Yukon-Kandick, and we were interested in an area there. And so I looked into how we would acquire rights there and worked on that. In addition to just the production department had some things going on here, and so I kept an eye on that. Not Swanson River, but certainly Cook Inlet. Yeah, we had an interest in 4 of the platforms there, and I went out to, I think it was Platform Dillon several times, but we weren't the operator, and I came in, and so we just were really monitoring it, keeping an eye on costs and watching our share at that time. Well, I continued there with Skelly in that office, and I'll tell you one thing that happened while I was there in Skelly's office. Next door to me was the Office of City Service, and O.G. Simpson, who yet later went to ARCO, he was with City Service then, and he used to come up and visit the City Service office. Very nice fellow. He'd wander in and sit down because Skelly had some joint venture projects with Sinclair at that time. And so we'd visit. And then down the hall were a few other offices. Also down at the end of the hall was the WOGA, the Western Oil and Gas Association. Bill Bishop, the man who marked his boot was bronzed. He is the one who dug in his heel, he raised his heel and made the mark and said, "Drill here," as legend holds it and has it. And so he was there in the office, and then working with him was Bill Hopkins, who later succeeded him, but Bill Bishop ran the office in those days. And so we kept in touch in that way. But one day I was working there at my desk on the 5th floor, and window washers came in, and I was working, and a guy was working, and we were talking, and he started asking me some questions about Skelly Oil, and I answered him, but I was a bit of an irritant, frankly, but I tried to be polite to him and answered him, and he kept working, and then he asked one question, and I knew that related to a property owned by one of the Skelly sisters. It was not owned by Skelly Oil. And once in a while when I was with Skelly, I was tasked to look out for the Skelly sisters, who were the daughters of Bill Skelly, the founder of the company. So I looked up then, I put the file away, and I said, "Now how do you know about that?" And he said, "Oh, I knew old Bill Skelly." Then I really pushed the file away, and I said, "Well, tell me about that one." I said, how do you know him? And he's picking up his mop bucket and finishing with his squeegee. And then he started pulling around and turned around, and he said, "Oh, the old son of a bitch," he says, "he's my uncle." He says, "We never got anything from him." He says, "We had to move to California." And he walked out the door, and he went straight across the hall to the opposite office. And I thought, gee whiz, somebody's pulling my leg here. But before he could move anywhere else, I went out in the hall, and there was another window washer right down the hall. I went and got him, and I asked him, "Could you come up here?" And I said, "What's that fellow's name there, right there, that fellow washing the window?" He said, "Oh, that's Bud Skelly." So I guess I was thinking about writing an article for the House Organ. They had this magazine, the Skelly Oil, that Skelly Air visits Skelly's man in Anchorage, and maybe put my picture prominently there with him, but I didn't. But that's just a little aside story of something that happened. So In any event, I decided to take the bar exam while I was here, the Alaska bar exam. And because I'd only been admitted in Missouri and then time in the Army and time I'd spent in Texas, I didn't need to go into court the work I was doing. So I was taking the bar exam, and a couple of other guys I was studying with, one of them with Phillips Petroleum and another one with Chevron, were thinking about studying or taking it. And so they mentioned that, can we form a study group? And I said, sure, that'd be good. So we did. And then they suggested bringing in Bob Hardig, who was over at the Attorney General's office too. Really fine guy. And so Bob joined us, so there were the four of us. And we would meet regularly several times a week in the evenings and study for the bar exam. And one of us would take turns teaching, which is the best way to learn something, is to teach it to someone else. And then the others would participate. And we found it a very effective way to study and also to keep you on track studying. So through 1968, and into a part of 69, why we were doing that. And then at some point, Bob Hardig told me, he said, we've got a shortage of lawyers that know anything about the oil and gas business. And he said he was the chief of the civil section in the Attorney General's office here. And there were a lot of people that were good lawyers there, but the knowledge of the oil business was very sparse here in Alaska in those days. Not just among lawyers, but among the public in general. That's one observation I made when I came up here. Coming out of Texas, every rancher knew everything about not just what a royalty was, but I want a tailgate royalty, and I want this, and I want that in my lease. But up here in Alaska, people really didn't understand the business, and it made them more suspicious of the industry also. Down where people understood it, they were less suspicious. So, in any event, Bob Hardig asked if I would like to come to work there, and I thought about it, and Alaska had really grown on me. And my next assignment at that time in May was to be moved to Calgary, Alberta. And so I made a quick trip over to Calgary and checked it out, but by that time Alaska had bitten me and grown on me, and I decided, yes, this is where I'd like to plant roots. So I landed here. I took the job with the Attorney General's office. I left Skelly on good terms, and I landed over in the Attorney General's office. And then I was off and running. And I hadn't even been admitted to the bar yet. My job was contingent upon passing the bar exam. So I had to then continue to study for the bar, which would be given in September. And so I continued to do that at night and work during the day. And I had lots and lots of interesting oil and gas cases while I was at the Attorney General's office. Well, we were working on the ownership of the entire lower Cook Inlet. I think you might be familiar with that. Right now, there is a dividing line at Calgon Island, and then below that, it's considered federal waters outside the 3 mile line. And we considered that to be an historic bay. There was a theory there that Cook Inlet, the line of closure, should have been at the mouth of Cook Inlet. And we thought we had a very credible argument. And all of these land ownership and ownership to submerged lands were being fought out in court at that time. And so that was probably one of the biggest. The governor put the tanker Tustamina at our disposal. We went up and down the Cook Inlet checking out the facts and looking at things. And then the amounts of research were tremendous. That case ultimately went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against the state of Alaska and in favor of the federal government. But it was a large case, and had Alaska owned it, we'd have much more control over leasing rights and ownership in the lower Cook Inlet. Right now, that is within the grasp of the federal government. Same thing with Tustamina Lake. There was a withdrawal for the Moose Range, but Tustamina Lake itself, the submerged land area, wasn't mentioned. So we decided to go for that. And that may have been a bit of a reach, but if you don't go for it, you don't know. So we ran that with that case. For me personally, there was a case. The case was called Tipperary Land versus City Service versus Tipperary Land, and Tipperary Land had won a lease, and City Service felt that there were imperfections in the way Tipperary had qualified itself to bid, that it was, I believe, an Australian corporation, and it was not properly qualified. They challenged it in court. The state felt like this was too much of a technicality, and the state was siding with Tipperary and wanted to go ahead and issue the lease. It went to the Superior Court and then to the Supreme Court. So one of the lawyers, I was still pretty fresh there in the AG's office, Attorney General's office, and one of the other senior lawyers was preparing his argument, and I was trying to explain to him how the oil and gas, this was a fact-driven argument, and I was trying to explain to him how the oil business works and how the timing of drilling wells can determine the value of other properties, and how by drilling a well you can condemn another things like that. And finally, he just turned to me a couple hours before the argument. He said, "Would you like to argue this?" And I thought I said, "Okay, sure." So my first time ever in court in Alaska, I went in and I argued before the Supreme Court of Alaska. And so that was a pretty big step for me to go into court and be able to argue before the Supreme Court of Alaska. Other than that, we had a lot of other cases. We had a lot of cases that came out of the 1969, the September 69 oil and gas lease sale. That in itself is almost a whole topic that I could talk about for an hour. I was getting calls from all over, from Europe, from Belgium, I remember. Our regulations that nobody paid too much attention to for years, people were calling in and they were saying, now, when you say cash, what exactly does cash mean? A cash bond, or what does this mean? What does that mean in the regulations? And you'd have to get back to them. I mean, things that seemed to be obvious as people from foreign countries were asking it. And then I remember vividly the day of the big oil and gas lease sale. And then there were a number of lawsuits that were in the fallout of that sale. There was a Champion, I believe it was Champion Oil Company, filed a suit against the state of Alaska. Anybody that went back to the morgue, the newspaper morgues, and looked at it, I remember there was a headline, State Attorney General's Office, very busy fighting off lawsuits as a result of oil and gas lease sale. One other thing I did that was new to me, we got a report of oil spillage out of Homer. People were reporting it, and it was a tanker that had left. It had anchored there briefly and then come up the inlet to Drift River. And so I got a call one afternoon, and it was from the Coast Guard. And they said, we're going over to Drift River. We want to try to hold that tanker, but since it's not out on the high seas, and we need some state legal enforcement there, because if we seize it, we need some state presence. So as a representative of the Attorney General, I went over there and we seized that tanker and held it till we could complete an investigation. And I remember taking the deposition up there on the bridge of that tanker. And I remember the captain's name was Captain Majerski. And you can sit up there and you can look out the window and look out on Cook Inlet. And Captain Majerski, he was being grilled, but at one point he said, wait, look, at this moment right now, I see an oil slick right there going by on Cook Inlet. Now get that down in the report. Right now, what he was pointing to is someone else had an oil slick going by right now too, and he wanted to be sure that was known, because that was his point, is Cook Inlet is full of oil slicks at that time, which I'm making no observation on. And we did ultimately penalize them and settle them. It was the tanker Eagle Leader. I can't remember where it was flagged out of, but for me personally, again, that was an experience. And then at that time in the Attorney General's office, we were dealing with the oil companies. The oil companies had been paying varying prices, taking varying price deductions, cost deductions for transporting oil off the platforms. There was not much uniformity, and there was no such thing as a field posted price in Cook Inlet. So it didn't really fit the wording of the lease form. And Thomas E. Kelly, and he was quite a character, a wonderful guy to work with, and I think a real man of integrity. And he came up here and he really took control of things. But he said, we're going to straighten this out, and we're going to get a price answered, and we're going to get a uniform price set in Cook Inlet. And so his final solution right then was to have the state start taking its royalty oil in kind. And the details of the controversy escape me at this moment, but that led to legal battles with the oil industry, and we litigated heavily on that. And I was in court a lot on that. The oil companies were resisting. At one point, they resisted allowing the state to take in kind, and then we had the right in the provision, though, that they then had to store right on the lease the state's oil share, so we countered with that, and they had no ability to do that unless they constructed other. So finally, we pushed back and forth, and we reached an accommodation there. But the point was that Tom Kelly's point was he wanted to be able to sell the state's royalty oil to what was ultimately Tesoro at a price, and that would establish a price in Cook Inlet that would be a benchmark price for the other companies to have to meet instead of pulling numbers out of the air. And Kelly was a very aggressive guy, and I think as is known at the time of the oil sale, the $900 million oil sale, which was huge for Alaska, just huge. At the time I was in the State Attorney General's office, our entire budget was $100 million for the state of Alaska, as I recall. So you can imagine the infusion of cash. I mean, this state was a very poor state at that time, and it was welcome and to be able to have this oil and gas development going on. In my career in the oil industry, I worked up through the administrations of Governor Walter Hickel and Governor Keith Miller. And then, although my appointment was not political, some of the people that I worked under in the office, their jobs were over with the loss of the election. Governor Keith Miller lost the election. And consequently, so a lot of the people that I enjoyed working with then left the jobs, and I was sort of left there somewhat alone. And there was a lot of changeover. There were a lot of new strange people coming into the office, different people, I'll say. Good people, but just different abruptly at the time of the changeover. So I began to think about also moving out, and I talked, and Bob Hardig had made the decision to go out into private practice at that time. And so I teamed up with Bob and another lawyer, Jim Rhodes, that was in the Attorney General's office with us. And we went out into private practice at that time and formed a law firm. And that was the beginning of our law firm. And we moved into an office at 717 K Street. And that started me then in practice for the next probably 30 or more years, 35 years. I would like to tell one quick story about our Governor Keith Miller. I think, as we all know living here in Alaska, it's a wonderful experience because we all know so many people so well. I mean, it's nothing, we've all known virtually every governor we've ever had. We know our senators and our congressmen. We expect to know them, and our representatives. And so I worked closely with Governor Miller, but this story was told to me by Bob Hardig. At the time of the Native Claims Settlement Act and also the pipeline, was it the pipeline? No, yeah, it was the Pipeline Act. It was necessary for Alaska to go back and testify before Congress frequently. So on one of these excursions, the governor went back with Kent Edwards, the Attorney General, and Bob Hardig, head of the civil section, the oil and gas civil section chief. They went back to Washington, and they arrived, and at that time it was a 5-hour time difference, so you were never ready to go to bed when you arrived in Washington because of the time difference. And Keith Miller, our governor, he always liked country and western music, and he liked to get into a bar, and then sometimes he'd like to sing. So they changed their clothes and got into comfortable clothes, and the governor asked the cab driver, told him, find me a bar where we can go on out and find some good music. So they asked the bar, and he took them to this place, and they went into a bar, and they set them up, and they had these big beer mugs of suds, and the governor was there, and the Attorney General was there, Kent Edwards, and Bob Hardig, and they're there, and the waitress is saying, hey, where are you guys from anyway? And they told him, we're from Alaska, what do you do? And asked Hardig, and he said, well, I'm Attorney General's office there, I'm Assistant Attorney General. You are really, what do you, and she asked Edwards, what do you do? He said, well, I'm the Attorney General. So she looks at Miller, and he's drinking a beer, and she says, yeah, and I guess you're the governor. And he's got this frost of beer, and he went down, governor, he says, yep. and that was a true story as told to me by Bob Hardig, which tells you what a small place it is in Alaska and how we're all, we were at that time all just folks in a new endeavor, in a new state, getting along. But at that time, there were a lot of things converging. There was NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, that was new in 1969. I mean, there wasn't such a thing, and it cropped up, and it just got right in the face of the development of the pipeline as well as other projects having to do a NEPA statement. There was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was converging because the exploration on the North Slope precipitated the filing of claims, and the freeze, what was known as the freeze and the super freeze, filed by Udalls, that I think I referred to earlier. And then there were all of these other different broad statewide actions that just changed the whole map and the complexion of Alaska, and it was all in play. And amidst of that, there were many, many companies here still moving around, so many. I mean, if I sat and started naming them, they were separate companies too, Conoco and Chevron and Amoco and Amerada Hess and just over and over. I mean, there were, probably 15, 20 companies. The Petroleum Club was a rollicking place very often, and you could go up there. The producing companies, the heads of the producing companies, you go up there and just sit down and have a beer with Harry Jamison or whoever. All of the producing companies were there. That's one thing I noticed today, is that is lacking now, and I think it's too bad, and it's also, I think, a mistake on the part of the producing companies to pull back and not engage more with the average Alaskan the way that they used to. For me personally, the most significant event was probably, overall generally, was probably a culmination. I worked, I guess to lead up to this, I did a great many things, litigation. I did probably 1,000 different title opinions. I worked on operating agreements, unit agreements, numerous things, but I think probably a culmination of all of that was when I was getting ready to leave private practice, and I was asked, Sarah Palin had resigned her position at the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I think that happened on a Thursday, and I got a call saying they needed someone immediately, and so I came in and dropped in there on a Monday morning and started out. And by virtue of my background, I was able to do that because I had previously been, in my days at the Attorney General's office, legal counsel to the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So I think the 10 years I spent at the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission sort of capped off my time here. Although I have met so many wonderful people here in the industry, in the companies, in the support industry, out in the community, and it has been one great grand adventure. I think anyone that's been a part of this, I think we all have to feel somehow privileged and enriched to have been here at this time, as we were here right at the end of, at the time following statehood, Swanson River, and coming into Cook Inlet as it was being developed, seeing Tesoro come in, Collier Chemical Fertilizer Plant, then the shifting to the North Slope, all of those things. But to sum up my answer, Joe, I think probably my time at the Oil and Gas Commission and it expanded my downhole knowledge. That was where I didn't have a lot of knowledge. I had pretty good knowledge of surface geology and so forth, and certainly the workings of oil and gas agreements. But I had to really expand my brain and understanding, and that's always good to be challenged. And it was fun every day to be able to do that type of work. I think some of my disappointments, one disappointment I have, I don't know if this will directly answer your question, but I think I would like to have seen more flexibility with land availability in the state of Alaska. And the reason I say that is Alaska is known as an owner state, which is fine. It's created this fund that we all receive permanent fund dividends. But there's a great disconnect from that, and most people don't understand that any more than a lot of people understand when they flip on a light switch where the electricity is exactly coming from. And in landowner states, when I was chairman of the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, one aspect of that for a year was to chair the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission and to interact with all of the commissions all over the United States and to see the workings of all of the different states, every single state, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, every state. And I watched them and I toured areas. And I could see how people reacted where the average person had some more direct participation in the workings of the state. And in some states, a state like Texas, there is a real lobby for the industry. Even so, states like Louisiana, perhaps, other states, less so in Alaska, because a lot of the population is decoupled from it, and they don't really feel the tie to it. They don't make the connection about the benefits that the industry has provided to this state and is providing and continues to provide and can provide in the future. And I think there are ways to get around that. It would take, another half hour for me to go into my theories on how that could be done. But I think we could remain a landowner state, but we could still allow more opportunities for Alaska to be the way it was when I came up here. When I came up here, there were lots of private individuals involved in the industry. I mentioned Locke Jacobs, for example. He was well known in the industry, or Lum Lovely. These were names that members of the Petroleum Club, they were well known. They made their money, private individuals, just owning leases, participating with companies. There's lots of different deals. You can lease, you can farm out, you can sell part of it. Companies can approach a private individual and make a deal much more quickly than they can with working with the government, or having to wait through the lengthy process of a government deciding that it will open up an area of land for leasing. And right now, that's, I think, a deterrence to more exploration. And I don't have a doubt that there is a lot more oil and gas to be discovered here in Alaska, particularly oil. And I think it's too bad that we're ignoring that. And in some ways, perhaps Prudhoe Bay was our great blessing, and it's been a curse because it's almost made it too easy. And people have sat back and said, well, that's it. And when that's over, it's all gone. But no, it's not. That oil is out there, and it's never been easy. And I mean, the Permian Basin right now and what's going on there and what's going on elsewhere. And that oil is going to be needed in order to bridge the gap, whatever future energy sources we develop, be they wind energy or solar power or other sources. We need to be able to bridge that gap, and we're nowhere near that yet. And when I say bridge the gap, I mean do it without subsidies. You're not bridging a gap if you're taxing one industry and then using that money to subsidize solar power or wind power or something else. I mean, until these other industries are efficient enough to stand on their own. And that's what I think we have to do. Now, I don't know if that really, it's a bit of a disappointment to me that Alaska still doesn't fully understand the oil industry. We are an oil-producing state, but we don't behave like an oil-producing state. And by not behaving like an oil-producing state, we're languishing. We're losing our place among oil-producing states. I would tell them that the oil and gas industry is, I think, a very, very noble undertaking. And I know there is perhaps some hesitance now, much more so. To me, it was a great adventure and a calling when I entered that, not just for someone like me with my training in law and geology, but for someone in geology, geophysics, petroleum engineering, other endeavors, the service companies. It was a grand calling. We were meeting the nation's energy needs. Now there's a certain feeling, and I think it's been caused somewhat by a lot of false information being put out about climate change. And a lot of young people don't really have good, accurate information. There certainly may be some climate change going on. There may be some effects around the edges. It certainly is not CO2. The science doesn't support that. Methane, yeah, methane can be a potent greenhouse gas in certain circumstances. But the whole term climate change, I think that was a shift from the notion of global warming whenever we figured out that there's global warming and there's global cooling. And it also ignores the fact that of the grander scheme of things in which right now we're in an interglacial period and we'll be in another glacial period. You give us enough years. Anybody wants to take a bet from me on that, I'll take your money right now and let somebody hold it, but that's coming again. Everybody thinks the seashores are rising. Yeah, perhaps, but I'll show you ancient seashores, evidence of them far, far inland, where I'll show you the shells, I'll show you the ancient beaches, and I'll show you where the ancient sea line was, far, far out to sea also. There's always been the continents moving. So there has always been climate change. And I think there is a lot of hysteria piggybacking on that. And I think it's being used as a basis for certain frivolous lawsuits against the oil industry. And I think a lot of people, young people particularly, are being unnecessarily frightened and discouraged by that also, and I think that's unfortunate. My time here has been, I just want to say that the time I have had here has been one grand, wonderful adventure. I have met great professionals. I have met wonderful quality people in the state of Alaska, men like Tom Marshall, O.K. Gilbreth. Tom Marshall comes to mind, and he was a good friend of mine. I worked with him when I first came up here and was legal counsel. Tom Marshall told me a story. Tom Marshall told me that when he went ashore as a young infantryman, he was moving into the hedgerow country, and it was so thick he couldn't see. And he looked up one time, and there, pointed straight down to him, was a German, and it was a German, I think it was Kriegsmarine, a German a naval type troop with a gun pointed straight towards him, and the man was pointing with a branch, and he was trying to get the gun down against a branch pointed to Tom, and Tom was trying to get his gun up, and then the man behind him shot him. But Tom Marshall came that close to getting killed at that moment. And had we not had a Tom Marshall, we would not have selected that area on the North Slope. I'm confident of that, having looked carefully into the history of this. Had we not selected that area would be under federal control. And I'm sure drilling would have been off limits there. And so, or greatly restricted. But I mean, you can see the areas that what the federal government has done with the areas that have been under its management. The finest minds of the federal government to the west, they've drilled 50 or more wells, virtually dry holes, and to the east you've got the wildlife refuge. But right there is the area that they overlooked, and that's where the oil was. So, I mean, that tells you about allowing the government to make these decisions for you. But a man like Tom Marshall came in there and was able to apply some decisions. But it tells you again how sometimes history hangs by a thread, and I wanted to throw that little anecdote out there so Alaskans can be thankful for that we had a man like Tom Marshall, that we had men like O.K. Gilbreth, that we've had generally good people all the way down the line, I think, through the years in our government. I believe we've, by and large, generally had honest people. The people I've encountered in industry have, by and large, always been, I say this now as a regulator, have generally been good people. You could pick up the phone, you could call them and tell them, and they would generally respond. Enforcement actions were not often needed. And we also have, I think, the reputation for having one of the best regulatory systems in Alaska in the world, one of the cleanest environments in the world. Our sets of regulations are excellent, and I was interviewed a few years ago when I was still at the commission, by German public television, and the young lady interviewing me posed the oft-asked question, shouldn't we save the oil in the strip, in the coastal strip along the wildlife refuge, the North Slope Wildlife Refuge? Shouldn't that be set aside, though, even though it's small, shouldn't it be set aside and just saved for the future? And I said, well, think about that, though. Look at the number of barrels consumed in the world now. At that time, I think the total consumption in the world was, 90 million barrels a day. I don't know if I have my number right. I think it is, but let's say it was. I said, that isn't going to change. And I said, what you're doing is that oil's going to be supplied somewhere else. And I said, go to Nigeria right now. See how that oil's being produced. Look at the billions of cubic feet being flared right now in Nigeria. We don't allow flaring. I said, look at the oil pooled up on the ground. We don't allow that. I said, go to Ecuador. Look at how development is proceeding there right now. And I cited other places. And I told her, what better place to have development than under the watchful eye of the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, being done right and being done by an industry here that's proven it knows how to do it right.